And first up tonight, we head to Canberra for a chat with the author of a new book, Battlers and Billionaires. There's the book in your bookshops now, a title that grabbed my interest, and then I saw the author was a politician. Sounded a tad more interesting than some of those other ALP tomes of late, and more being penned to, no doubt, right now. But this one's an actual economist. He won the Young Economist of the Year in 2011 even. So here to discuss this and maybe other political matters, Labor MP for the Canberra seat off Fraser, Mr Andrew Leigh. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jane.
Now, I have to ask you firstly, because I give economists a bit of a tickle along here, the Young Economist of the Year award. Tell us about that. I know it was 2 years ago, but it sounds impressive.
Well, so the Economic Society of Australia sits down every couple of years and I guess goes back through CVs of what economists have been publishing, and I managed to get a little bit done when I was an ANU economics professor and was fortunate enough to win the award. I think they were slightly torn because I'd just become a politician at that point and they weren't sure whether or not I'd sold my credibility down the streets. So,
gee, that's a hard one, economist politician.
Exactly.
Credibility.
And, it's sort of interesting, to be honest, Janine. I've found myself reverting to type a little bit more the longer I've been here. I think actually what you bring to the Parliament is something to be valued, not chucked away. So I find myself playing the economist in most of the rooms that I'm in, and I think that's actually of more value to the Parliament than if I try and behave like the person next to me.
I was going to say that's because you'd be a rarity at someone who actually understands the figures they're all debating, isn't it?
Oh, look, there's a variety of sets of skills in the Parliament, and there's terrific economists on the other side. I really admire Arthur Sinodinos, for example, somebody who really thinks deeply about this. And, you know, Parliament, there was William Buckley who once said that he'd rather be ruled by the first 2,000 names in the Boston phone book than by the entire faculty of Harvard University. So there's an optimal level of professors in the Parliament, and maybe we've got to that already.
All right, let's, before I get to the book, I do have to ask you the obvious questions. You were well known as a Gillard supporter. We've seen a lot of them suddenly embrace the second coming, and everybody's got a spring in their step, and the polls were great. Now the polls are starting to ease off a bit. How are you feeling at the moment?
I've always believed we could win the next election, fundamentally because I think we have a better set of policies for Australia's future. I think that Australians are more optimistic than people sometimes give them credit for. People want to hear ideas, values, and they want to know not just what you can do for the next 3 years, but actually what kind of Australia you want our kids to be living in.
But as a Gillard supporter, are you surprised, or have you been swept along in this new mood? I mean, do you now concede as many do? Gosh, we might have been attacked for it, but it seemed to have been the right thing to do.
I really admire the spring in the step that I see from some of my marginal seat colleagues. I think they've got a great sense of enthusiasm. I believed they could win a month ago, but for many of them, they've got a great sense of enthusiasm. And look, there is no doubting Kevin Rudd's energy, drive, and commitment. I firmly believe that we'll win the next election.
Right. Now, as somebody who understands the economy and mentioned the word confidence before, do you agree an election date should be announced to help bring confidence back to businesses that are struggling? We had another retail person today warned about it. I mean, does it worry you that dragging out this, you know, what no one knowing is not adding to certainty on what should be good economic times?
I don't see much evidence of it, Janine. I think that certainly we've seen a partisan effect on confidence, and you can see that just by taking the consumer confidence numbers and splitting them out from Labor and coalition supporters. There's never been a bigger partisan difference, largely because Mr Abbott has been so strong in talking down the Australian economy. That, I think, is the big effect, and whether or not the Prime Minister sets an election date this week or next, I think is not particularly important. He's just behaving in accordance with the Constitution, as every Prime Minister's done before him.
Ooh, was that a slip? You think it will be this week or next? We're not going to wait till October and after the G20 then?
Oh, perhaps we will. This is one of those things
know
where
either,
I will find
you?
out at exactly the same moment as you.
Yes,
these things
so much
are
for
very tightly
consultation.
held.
So much for consultation.
Look,
Okay.
these decisions have always been made in a fairly tight grouping, and that's true whichever party's in power.
Yeah, well, it'll be good to get it over with. Now, let's get to the book. Battlers and Billionaires. Now, to be frank, this seems almost a bit dated given that the new-look Labor Party, the first thing Chris Bowen said was, oh, class warfare's over, we're sick of that. Did you feel that perhaps you were on the wrong Daily Memo now?
I think there's always a right time to be talking about egalitarianism, Janine. We are a country where egalitarianism sits deep in our national identity. We tend to sit in the front seat of taxis. Most of us don't like tipping. We prefer using the word mate to the word sir. And we've had past central bank governors called Nugget and Nobby. I talk in the book about some of the great egalitarian stories, about the story of the hospital wards after the Bali bombings, where Graham Southwick, the Aussie doctor on call, went bed to bed, and every patient said, I'm doing all right, save the painkillers for the person in the next bed. And the way in which that reminded one historian, John Hurst, of accounts of World War I, where Aussie soldiers in World War I kept on saying, no, don't give the painkillers to me, give it to the bloke in the next bed, he's hurting more. There's something deeply Australian about these
as you
stories.
call it in there, the fair go tradition, and we all know that's the sometimes a bit of a myth, but it's that image we have of ourselves. But just getting back to what we've seen the last few years, because you mentioned the BRW rich list, the growth of the Palmers and the Reinhardts, and they certainly were the least popular billionaires. But there is a feeling that the class warfare campaign that we saw by Wayne Swan backfired, that it was wrong, that Australians don't want it. Would you agree with that?
I don't regard it as class warfare to simply map the fact that wages for the top tenth have grown 59% after inflation since the mid-70s. Wages for the bottom 10% have grown 15%. I don't regard it as class warfare to simply acknowledge the fact that the top 1% share has doubled or the top 0.1% share of incomes has tripled. They're the facts as they are. The question then is what we want to do about that. And what I argue in Battlers and Billionaires is that some of the factors that have driven the rise in inequality are very good things as a whole. Technology and globalisation, well, we wouldn't want to reverse them. So then we've got to come up with creative ways, like better investment in education for the most disadvantaged, to try and make sure that all boats are rising at a similar rate.
It's interesting now, this disparity, we're not just seeing it here, lots of Western economies are seeing it. It's grown bigger in the UK and the US. And now what was interesting was the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was basically a reaction against that, was huge in the US. It got a lot of traction in the UK. It didn't really take off here. Do you think people just aren't as concerned?
I think that's you've hit the nail on the head there, Janine. It was really striking looking at how it filled entire parks in the US, and then in Australia it was a much more muted movement. Partly that reflects the fact that the economic slump was much less serious here than in the US or the UK, and we know that recessions hit the poor hardest. So one of the things I talk about in Battlers and Billionaires is the importance of economic growth. If you care about the poor, then an anti-growth policy is deeply wrong. So, but also I think there is a risk that Australians perhaps have missed the extent to which our economic reality of rising inequality is getting out of step with our egalitarian notions of a country which enjoys the fair go.
To be fair to you, you don't, you weren't, as you mentioned, Gina Rinehart and Clive Palmer, but you resist the cheap shots that some had at them. But since the book, we've seen the rise of the Palmer Party. Where does he fit into what you're saying? I mean, I don't think you need to highlight the differences because I think he kind of blows himself up, doesn't he?
Well, Mr Palmer is certainly a unique figure in Australian political life. No one else has given $4 million to a party only to then resign from it and run against it. And he's certainly worked extremely hard for his money, but one of the points that I make in the book is that many of Australia's mining entrepreneurs have benefited greatly from the massive increase in commodity prices.
Well, you're being nice. I don't think he's actually ever mined anything. He mines the market, but there you go. But that was always the point I wanted to make, that I think a lot of those attacks on those billionaires and Andrew Forrest, they didn't really need to, because people like Gina Reinhardt and Clive Palmer, I think, do their own bad press without having to highlight it. And as I say, in your book, you do the bigger picture rather than the personal attacks, I know.
That's right. And the other picture that I want to draw out is the fact that for my 90-year-old grandfather, most of his life has seen Australian inequality falling. For the first 60 years of his life, incomes rose faster at the bottom than the top. And so this last 30 years is a bit of an anomaly. This period in which Australia has pulled apart into two Australias.
Okay, well,
I want to highlight the fact that's the exception, not the norm. Okay,
well, it's something to think about. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but the book, I'm holding it up here, Battlers and Billionaires. If you're interested in that debate, it certainly provides plenty of fodder. Thank you very much for your time, Andrew Leigh.
Thank you, Janine.
Time for a short break. When we return, the perennially popular James McCulloch in Brisbane, and Clive Palmer might get another mention.